Okay, hi everybody. This is the second batch of lecturing for video lectures that I want you all to give a listen to as part of Western civilization or ancient and medieval civilization. Like I did with the prior one, I'm going to record this in 3 segments so that you don't have to go through 45 minutes or so of lecture all at one long shot, but you can take each segment of 10 to 20 minutes on its own. So we'll see how we go. Our topic this time is to take a look at what happens to the Roman Empire in the end, or especially the Western Roman Empire. When we talk about large-scale divisions of history, this class is a course in ancient and medieval history. The breakup of the Western Roman Empire in the generation leading up to the year 500 is what we take to mark the end of the ancient period of history. So everything we've studied through this, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, the ancient Middle East, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, that we all consider ancient history, with the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, we mark the beginning of the medieval era of Western civilization. And so when we get into Units 4, 5, and 6, next week we'll be looking at medieval history, and we take that time around 500 to be a transition. At the same time, we ought to bear in mind that in real life, change in era doesn't come suddenly, right? It doesn't happen overnight. People did not go to bed on the evening of December 31st, 499, and wake up on the morning of January 1st in the year 500 and say, ancient times are over, now we're going to begin a new era, now we're going to begin the medieval era. To people at the time, they were completely unaware of the idea that later historians would mark this as a great turning point in history. These things rather accumulate gradually over years, decades, a couple of generations, so that with hindsight, from the perspective of us, hundreds, thousands of years later, we can look back and say, yes, that was indeed a major shift that marks a change in era. So remember that these are all sort of modern constructs to break history down into ancient history, medieval history, and then, of course, modern history later on. So, first of all, to set us up, to remind you of the topics we covered in the previous lecture on video, a number of changes had happened in the late Roman Empire, which are quite significant to think about. First of all, the style of rule, the way the empire operated, had moved away from the indirect rule of the Principate and moved into the much more direct, hard-handed style of rule of the Dominate, initiated by Diocletian, continued by Constantine and later emperors. The emperor was set off much more from the senators and the other leading classes of the Roman Empire. The emperor alone sat on a throne, wore a crown, looked much more like a monarch, set above and beyond all other people, rather than being treated as first citizen among all the many aristocratic senators and so forth. So that's one big shift in style of rule. You had much more direct governance with a larger bureaucracy, heavier taxation, a larger army, and just smaller provinces, allowing more governors to get more involved in local affairs. Just much more heavy-handed direct rule, characteristic of the late empire. Another thing that's important to bear in mind when we think about what happens to the Roman Empire is to remember that it had been partitioned east and west. Diocletian had done this. Constantine had undone it temporarily in 325, the later part of his rule, when he conquered the Eastern Emperor and made himself sole emperor for a while. But eventually the partition reasserted itself, and by the time you get to about 370, 380, it's become permanent again, and you're going to have this long-standing division with the Eastern Empire under its emperor at Constantinople, a city that Constantine built for himself in the east on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, and then the Western Empire based on Rome, of course, but then also later on emperors started using other cities as their capitals rather than Rome. Sometimes they were at Trier, up on the Rhine River, sometimes they were at Milan, sometimes they were at Ravenna, so a few different cities actually served as the capital of the Western Empire, other than Rome. So the Dominate, one major shift, partition, another major shift, and the other thing, of course, is that after Constantine, the late empire was a Christian empire. Constantine was the first Christian emperor. He would be followed by almost 200 years, over 150 years worth of future Christian emperors, both in the east and the west. There was only one exception to this, a nephew of Constantine's named Julian, referred to as Julian the Apostate by Christian writers because he was baptized Christian and then reverted to paganism. Julian ruled for about 3 years, between 363 and 366, so very, very temporary pagan interlude. Apart from him, all of the other late Roman emperors were Christians, so this rise of imperial Christianity, with all of its implications, with Christianity becoming wealthy and powerful and influential, Very, very important, and you have to remember this is also over a very extended period of time. In a course like this, where we zoom through centuries at a time, it seems like this is sort of a very quick blip of having a Christian late Roman Empire. But this is 165 years or so from Constantine's conversion in 311 to the collapse or the deposition of the last Western Roman Emperor in 476. That's a long period of time. That's almost all of American history since the Declaration of Independence. So we should remember how long a period of time this was for Christianity to take hold and sink in as the dominant religion of the empire. Okay, so that's all by way of background. The late empire is quite different from the early empire in these different ways. It dominate the east to west partition and Christianity emerging as its dominant religion. Now, when we think about the late empire, and when we think about the collapse of the western half of the late empire, the language you usually hear is language of decline and fall, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And this goes back to a very influential historian in the 18th century, Edward Gibbon, who published a work in multiple volumes in the late 1780s and early 1790s, which was called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon's point of view has been extremely influential, and most discussion ever since then about this period of time has always used Gibbon as a starting point. So it's really important to understand Gibbon's point of view. Okay, so I want to take a moment here to talk about what I'll call the Gibbon thesis, right? Gibbon's explanation for what happened to the Roman Empire and how did it fall. You can tell right from Gibbon's title, there's basically two parts to his argument. The first part is the decline part. How did the Roman Empire decline? What went wrong with it somehow? Conceiving of this as an internal problem. And then how did the Roman Empire fall, implying an outside problem, outside invasions which the empire was incapable of dealing with. So in Gibbon's view, there were these combined factors which came together to bring the Roman Empire to its end. One was that there was internal decline. And here Gibbon had in mind morality. He had in mind culture. Gibbon's idea was that the late Romans no longer had the good old patriotic values of duty and loyalty and service to country and patriotism that the early Romans had done back in the days of Caesar Augustus or back in the days of the Republic. So these old sort of stern Roman virtues of self-sacrifice and duty, which had built the empire and made it great, were falling by the wayside. People were living in luxury. People were living self-indulgently. People were no longer willing to make sacrifices for the empire, and therefore the empire fell apart. Was no longer had sort of the moral strength to sort of deal with the challenges it was facing. The other part of decline that Gibbon had in mind was Christianity. Ironically enough, we think of Christianity as a source of morality, but from Gibbon's point of view, Christianity was an otherworldly religion. It goes around preaching peace and love. It goes around preaching pie in the sky, going to heaven when you die. And in Gibbon's view, this was not the sort of thing which was going to produce a morality, which was going to make people into good, dutiful Roman soldiers, right, or Roman statesmen and jurists and all those other kinds of practical, worldly skills that were needed to build a great empire. So Gibbon thought that Christianity, although in one sense, of course, it's moral, actually contributed to the internal decay of the empire. As people got to be more and more Christian, Gibbon thought they got to be less and less interested in the glory of the empire and winning military glory and worldly service in the law courts and the government and the army, and rather people were going off to monasteries and going into churches and were doing all this otherworldly kind of stuff which didn't really help the empire become any stronger. So that's the decline part of Gibbon's thesis, sort of moral corruption and otherworldliness between them eliminated or weakened the traditional Roman values of duty and patriotism and military glory and such that had built the empire. On the fall side, what caused the empire to fall, Gibbon pointed the finger at barbarian invasions, right? That on the other side of the Roman frontiers, you had these barbarian peoples growing in number, growing in power, creating all this pressure on the Roman frontiers, invading, raiding, looting, and pillaging, doing all this kind of thing, and the Roman military being weakened by the lack of patriotism, by the Christian otherworldliness, reached the point where it was no longer able to fight these barbarians off, and they came pouring in across the borders and took over everything, and carved up the empire between themselves, and that's why there wasn't a Roman Empire anymore. These barbarian invasions came in and took over everything. Okay, so that's the Gibbon thesis. Moral decline, both because of general self-indulgence and because of Christianity, and barbarian invasions, on the other hand, tearing down this weakened, soft, corrupt Roman Empire. Okay, that's the basic idea. Gibbon's been very influential, and you will still find people today who will advocate for a version of the Gibbon thesis. Okay, it's not dead. There are still people out there writing books, eminent scholars even, who are writing books based on this 200-year-old thesis. But it is a 200-year-old thesis, and I would argue that the field has moved on a bit since then, and we have new perspectives for looking at this. There are some problems, significant problems with Gibbon's ideas. When you actually look at the sources and try and figure out what the basis is. And we have to understand, Gibbon was brilliant. He was a very, very accomplished scholar. But he was working within a certain kind of a framework that 18th century Enlightenment types of people worked within, and that caused him to interpret his sources in particular ways that we might not necessarily feel are warranted today. So on the one hand, let's look at this idea of decline. Okay, this idea of moral decline. We said there were two aspects of it. One, an increase in self-indulgence, and on the other hand, a Christian otherworldliness. Neither of those can really be sustained from the sources. You will indeed, in the late Empire, find all sorts of people, moralists, Roman moralists, who will write complaining about the luxury and vices and immorality of people around them, and saying, oh, look, compared to our forefathers, we've grown soft. We're no longer dutiful. Look at all you people. You no longer have real patriotism or a real sense of duty. You do indeed find writers in the late Roman Empire saying that kind of thing. The problem is that moralist writers in the Roman Empire had always said that kind of thing. If you go looking up moral writings, diatribes and speeches and letters from Romans living in the 2nd century AD, in the 1st century AD, even in the Roman Republic, you never find anybody saying, we Romans now are just as dutiful and patriotic as our ancestors were. They always compare themselves unfavorably to the older generations, right? They always look back to some sort of supposed golden age when everybody had been dutiful and patriotic. Okay, and they always, even in the days of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, when the empire is growing and building and at its height in power, they always say, we are soft, we are undutiful, we are patriotic, or rather you, my contemporaries, my neighbors are so, and, we need to, muster ourselves up to the patriotism of our ancestors. So when we see these late Roman moralists saying this kind of thing, the reality is not that Romans really are getting less dutiful and less patriotic and less willing to serve. What you're getting is the continuing of a kind of a moral tradition, right? A literary tradition that Roman writers normally used to speak with. Okay, so you can kind of dispense with that side. As for Christianity, Christian thinkers under the Roman Empire had to struggle with this because Christianity had been a pacifist religion back when it was illegal. Now you have a Christian emperor, and the reality is the emperor needs to execute criminals. The emperor does need to fight wars against the empire's enemies. And when you look at the thought of Christian writers in the late Empire, they wrestle with this for a while and they come up with ways to justify it. In particular, in the West, there's a very influential Christian thinker named Augustine, who develops a whole elaborate theory that we call just war theory, explaining when warfare is justified and how soldiers ought to conduct themselves, and really very effectively reconciles traditional Christian ethics with the demands of state and the need to conduct warfare and this kind of a thing. There's really no concrete evidence that there was any difficulty recruiting soldiers, or that the soldiers were any less effective on the battlefield than they had ever been. Sometimes they lost battles, more often they won them, pretty much the same as they always had. Through Roman history, the army was larger than ever. The Christian era doesn't seem to have produced any positive weakening of the empire. Furthermore, if you look at the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, it's not evenly distributed everywhere. If you remember, there's an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. Christianity had originated in the eastern part of the empire, right, in Palestine. Had spread. The biggest Christian centers were at places like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Ephesus in Asia Minor, places like this. These are Thessalonica up in Macedonia. These are all in the Eastern Empire, and these are big Christian centers. Monasticism emerges in Egypt and Syria, not in Gaul or Italy, although it eventually would spread there. The eastern half of the empire, by any realistic measure you can come up with, was far more Christian of a place than the Western Empire was. And yet, when we move the clock forward to 500 AD, the Eastern Empire, the most Christian part, is standing strong, while the Western Empire, the less Christian part, is broken up. So if Christianity is the variable which is causing the empire to become weaker or less able to deal with its challenges, you would need to explain why the most Christian part of the empire survives and the less Christian part of the empire does not. Right? So that's a major issue. It's the western part of the empire that we're going to see collapsing. The eastern part of the empire is going to survive almost 1,000 years, 900 and more years, about 980 years, longer than the Western Empire would. We call it the Byzantine Empire because after the Western Empire collapses, the Eastern Empire is no longer ruling Rome, so it's kind of weird to call it the Roman Empire, but it is still the East Roman Empire carrying forward. So, on the Christian front, also Gibbon's thesis doesn't really hold water. Okay, so neither moral decline nor Christianity somehow making people soft. None of that really actually holds up. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at barbarians, but let me deal briefly with one thing here. A lot of the language talking about barbarians entering the empire talks about these waves, uses language of pressure, of the sort of building flood of barbarians that the Romans' defenses on the frontiers are trying to hold back, but they can't because the pressure is way too high. And finally the barbarians burst through because the empire is no longer strong enough to hold them back. A scholar named Walter has made a very pointed comment about this, which he says, okay, what does all this pressure amount to? Where are all these floods of barbarians coming to? You know, how many of them are there generating all this pressure? The Roman Empire had a total population of something to the tune of 100 million. Any one major province or batch of provinces like Britain or Gaul would have run 3 million, 5 million, 7 million people in a given area. When you look for any kind of numbers on the quantity of barbarians who are entering imperial soil in the late empire, the biggest groups, the very biggest groups like the Visigoths and the Vandals, are numbering something to the tune of 80,000, at most 100,000 people. Okay, 80,000 to 100,000. There are not a lot of groups that are even that big. Most of them appear to be significantly smaller, 20,000, 30,000, 10,000, something along those lines. And there aren't enough groups altogether between all the various barbarian groups. We might be talking about 1 million people on the move total over a period of a century, century and a half. When you compare that to the 100 million, right, less than 1 million barbarians altogether, moving in groups not more than 80, 100,000, usually much smaller, moving into an empire with 100 million people, 1 million, 3 million, 5 million Romans in any given province, this suddenly doesn't really look all that impressive as an overwhelming flood of barbarians, right? The Romans far outnumbered them, had greater wealth, had greater government organization, had a larger, more organized military. It really doesn't work very well to explain the barbarians entering the empire as the barbarians were so terribly strong and were able to mount this enormous pressure, and the Romans were somehow just incapable of mustering anything that could hold them back. Doesn't really apply in that kind of a way. So as a result of all this, like I say, you will still find some historians, I'll call them neo-Gibbonites, who will try to preserve some version of Gibbon's thesis here, but a great many specialists in the period, and I'll include myself here, although I'm not totally a specialist on the late Roman Empire, more of an early medievalist, but a great many historians are what we now call transformationists, who argue there's something much more subtle, something much more complex, and something much more gradual going on than simple decline and fall. What we're looking at is a transformation of the Roman world with a lot of shifts in economy and politics and society and ethnicity and things going on. And that's what we're going to be looking at for the remainder of this lecture unit. Let me pause this video here and we'll go and take a closer look at barbarians in the next one. Thanks.